The planet has now entered what is called by scientists and others the rim of fire. The rim of fire can be located as starting in the South Island of New Zealand, going up through Indonesia, through Japan, to Alaska, coming down to California, and going down to Chile. And it touches a few other areas, but this is it. It's primarily the Pacific Basin, which is a rim of fire. And no nuclear explosion organized by man could ever even approximate the power of this rim of fire. The sun has recently gone into a new phase, a kind of phase it's gone into repeatedly in times past. A period of extreme violence, which used to come with an 11-year cycle, is now apparently coming with a 13-year cycle. What happened in Japan is simply a part of an ongoing process which is generated by nothing but the sun itself, the effect of the sun. Now, in order to deal with this crisis, which having hit the South Island of New Zealand, coming to Japan, headed in the direction of Alaska, headed in the direction of California, and down again toward Chile. This thing is something we're going to have to learn how to deal with. It's not a nuclear explosion. Nuclear explosions have nothing to do with this. It's a rim of fire, well known to all specialists in this area, on this subject. Now, what we can do about this will be presented to you in some detail in the following part of this report, which indicates to you what some of the problems are that we have to understand. Problems about what does the sun have to do with this? How do we know this? What do we know about it? What don't we know about it? What are we going to do about it? This indicates that we're going through a period, probably through this year into the year 2013, which will probably be a period of greatest risk for various parts, especially parts of the rim of the Pacific, the rim of fire. And so the report that's about to be given to you now, following my remarks here, will make the matter clear to you.
On the same day of the earthquake, there were auroras, the northern lights. People reported from Canada down as far south as Madison, Wisconsin, reported seeing these brilliant light shows in the nighttime skies. Now, was this just a coincidence that this occurred on the same day as the earthquake, or is there some type of correlation scientifically?
Well, it's very interesting. It was a phenomenal display of the aurora borealis. But to say that the earthquake caused the aurora, or that the aurora caused the earthquake, would be a mischaracterization. The aurora itself was apparently generated by what's called a coronal mass ejection from the sun, which impacted the Earth's magnetic field on Thursday afternoon. The coronal mass ejection was generated by a series of solar flares that occurred earlier in the week, Monday through Wednesday, which occurred in the context of the sun increasing in its solar activity after a several-year hiatus period. Now, the issue is that, yeah, the auroras were generated by the radiation from the sun. But if we look back at the past several earthquakes, you do see a correlation between solar activity and tectonic activity. For example, the recent earthquake that happened in New Zealand on February 22nd happened a little over a week after this whopper of a solar flare, which was the largest solar flare in 4 years. The Haiti earthquake, which happened last January 2010, occurred 2 or 3 days before a series of very powerful solar flares. So it's interesting that the coincidence and timing of the solar activity is so close in time with the tectonic activity, but you can't say that there's a causal relationship between them. So the question is, what is the relationship?
Just to clarify, has there been a change recently in these types of activities of the sun? I mean, you're saying that the aurora indicates some type of heightened activity on the sun. How frequent of an occurrence is this? Is this something that happens all the time, or has there been an increase?
Yeah, we're coming right out of the solar minimum, which is typically an 11-year cycle. That every 11 years it goes through a minimum and then a maximum. This particular cycle has been about 13 years, which has some interesting implications in terms of global climate. But usually it's an 11-year cycle. So you could look back and say, well, is there a correlation between increases of solar activity and increases of tectonic activity, such as the earthquakes, but also volcanism?
What is that cycle actually? What do you mean by the solar cycle itself?
Within the 11-year cycle, you see a decrease in the number of sunspots on the surface of the sun. And Herschel, back in the 1800s, recognized this, that the sunspots become more and more dense and then dwindle to nothing, and then get more and more dense and dwindle to nothing on a cycle of 11 years. It's actually a 22-year-long cycle, but it appears as an 11-year cycle because it goes from one pole to the other. But this is, when you have more sunspots, this represents the fact that the magnetic field of the sun, which is also known as the interplanetary magnetic field, because this thing goes all the way out past Jupiter and Saturn. These are periods that the magnetic field of the sun gets much more intense and much more active, which is what's represented by these by the sunspots. And the solar flares actually follow the path of the magnetic field off the sun. So these are periods of heightened magnetic phenomena on the sun.
Could you say something about the relationship between the sun and the earth? What is actually going on in that space? Because I think most people just have the concept of the sun providing warmth, providing light to the earth, but don't have much of an idea of what is that space between the earth and the sun.
Yeah, the big problem is that people consider that the solar system as a whole is really just, 9 objects floating around in empty space plus this big sun, and we're kind of defending ourselves in this little corner of the solar system all by our lonesome. When in fact, if you go back to the works of Kepler, even he recognized this, that we're dealing with a unified whole system, that there are not individual separate objects in the solar system, but that there's a solar system, and the activity of that system is as a whole system. So in that sense, you have to be interested and intrigued by the correlation between the increased solar activity and then the increased geophysical activity. Because if you look right now, you had the earthquakes in the past 2 years, which are some giant earthquakes and had various effects. At the same time, just recently, within the past week, we've had explosions of many of the volcanoes around the so-called Ring of Fire, the Pacific Ocean rim. So you have an increase in geophysical activity at the same time that you have an increase of solar activity. It'd be a fallacy to say that the sun, that these solar flares are like shooting at the Earth and creating these explosions on the Earth. It would be more accurate to say, and this is something that we have to follow up on in terms of actual experiments and investigation, it becomes more clear that the solar system as a whole is right now going into a more active period, which is represented by these outbursts from at least 2 known bodies in the solar system. And I would say that we should look for more outbursts like this.
Yeah, I think that the tendency would be to say, well, are the flares causing the earthquakes, or are the earthquakes causing the flares, when that's really not the right question, because you're looking at a highly dynamic system from what you're describing. Mm-hmm. And there's potentially a higher cause, but it seems like we're seeing some type of correlation between the